The institute where I work is a postgraduate training institute. We also have a clinical center. We do research, we do training, we do consultation with mental health organizations and other kinds of agencies. The majority of the clients that we see come from public agencies, community agencies like child welfare, child protective services, women's shelters, schools. So a large part of those clients are also what are called mandated clients. In other words, someone with some legal authority has said they have to come to therapy. So we not only think of the client as mandated, but also that the therapist is mandated, that we have to be there as well. There are about 17 of us on the faculty of the Institute, which makes it sound rather large, but it's really not. We're not all there together all the time. We come together and work around particular teaching programs, particular service or research projects. We all do multiple kinds of things. I do consultations myself with businesses, workshops. I teach in the psychology department at the university. One of the things that I was interested in very early was why would we in our ivory tower at the medical school think that we could do any better work with these clients who are often thought of as revolving door clients, or sometimes called treatment failures, as if they failed the treatment rather than we've been failed therapists. Why should we think that we could do anything better? So I began interviewing clients about their experiences of both successful and unsuccessful therapy, and of those therapists that they thought were helpful, and those therapists that they thought were not so helpful. And I did that for many years, not only in my own local setting, but as I traveled around the world, meeting clients in other cultures and other contexts. And a lot of what my colleagues and I learned from the clients' voices has been very important in the direction that our practice has moved over the years. There was a time when we were very interested in language. And by language, at that time, we were thinking in terms of not only the spoken word, but people's beliefs, values, and assumptions. This is in the early 1970s. And we were working mostly with families. And we had the idea, influenced by the group that some of you who've been studying family or systems therapy may have heard about, the MRI group, the later work that was first started by Gregory Bates and Donald Jackson. And I'm oversimplifying this, but they used language in a very strategic sense. And their idea was that if you could understand the family's language, then you could place your questions, you could place your advice, you could place your interventions, your homework assignments in the family's language. And the family would be more apt to take on or more apt to not resist what you were offering as a therapist. And this was a time when there were a lot of family therapy gurus going around and doing all of these interviews on stage in front of hundreds of people that looked so magical. And we were very captivated by this. And we thought, there's something here. Maybe we would try to learn more about our clients' language, the family's language. So we had always worked with teams and two therapists together in the room. So we continued working that way. And so two of us as therapists would meet with a family. And all kinds of things began to happen. They began to be very influential in the direction that we would take. Some of those were, one of the first things that we began to realize was that a family does not have a language. The individual members of the family each have their own language. And that language is not only spoken words, but it's any way anyone tries to communicate, express, or articulate, whether that's with words, signs, or symbols, a sigh, a glance. So I don't confine language to words the way that we usually think of when we speak of language. I also don't think in terms of verbal and nonverbal language, because I think, unfortunately, there's a tradition in the field of psychotherapy that as therapists we are experts in nonverbal language. And we know what a glance means. We know what it means when someone sits like this, or crosses their leg, or crosses their arms. And we begin to make those often silent interpretations or kind of our own translation of the other person's actions or words, or the way they're breathing or moving their eyes. And those begin to influence how we see the person, how we respond to them, what we inquire about, the kinds of questions that we ask. So I don't want to think of myself or a therapist as an expert in another person's behavior or in another person's words, what they mean. I don't want to attribute my meaning to them, nor do I want to begin to work from that kind of privately created now. So not only did we begin to realize that each person in the family had their own unique view of quote-unquote the problem, the solution, and also what the therapist would or would not be doing to reach a resolution with that problem. We also found ourselves, as we were talking with a family, talking with one member of the family very intensely, one person at a time. Because what began to happen as we began to try to, quote unquote, again, learn the person's language, we found that we became very interested in what they were saying. We became very interested in their story, their version of the story, and sort of captivated by it, like when you're reading a really interesting novel. And we found ourselves not only talking with each person one at a time and very captivated by these multiple versions of the story, but that also we began to talk with clients differently, and particularly we began to ask different kinds of questions. Now, I don't think that there are certain kinds of questions that you ask. I don't have like a recipe of questions or a backpack full of questions that I'm bringing with me. What I'm referring to is that we began to ask questions that were more closely connected with what the client, the family member, was saying, to learn more about that. Something else that began to happen is that we began to notice, as we were talking with each person intensely, that the other members seemed to be listening, and listening differently. There was less of this sort of sitting on the edge of your chair, waiting to jump in and give the more correct version of the family story. There were less interruptions, intrusions. And we would hear people say to each other things like, I hadn't heard you say it exactly like that before. I really didn't know you thought about it that way. So it began to occur to us that not for the family members and sort of telling each version of the story, telling a different story. It wasn't like telling a secret or sharing new kinds of information or facts. It wasn't that. It was almost like that what was already there was being put together differently. And not only that, that when you have what we begin to think about is speaking and listening positions, you speak differently and you listen differently. Because often as therapists, we assume we're ahead of our client. We're sometimes really not listening to what they say because we already know the end of the story. We've heard it before. And we already know what should be done because we've got our map here with us that tells us what to do. So what began to happen is that this was also in the time when interventions were I guess interventions were still real popular, although I don't think it was interventions. But you tried to have sort of the heavy-duty intervention, not the fly swatter, but sort of the atomic bomb intervention. What we began to realize is that as therapists, we didn't have to work so hard to come up with these things that we thought that these clients of ours should or could be doing. That would be the better way to lead their lives. That they would come back session after session and would have done things that we would have never been so creative or clever to come up with. So we began to just gradually leave this whole idea of intervention behind. But one of the first things that I think of when I think of a postmodern perspective, of this postmodern umbrella and the ideas that I mentioned, is that it really invites us to have a skeptical, a questioning, a critical, not critical in a negative sense, but critical in a thoughtful, reflective sense, of the grand narratives, the dominant discourses in our world that we're not only born into, but we step into in our educational system. And that for the most part, they're invisible, they're taken for granted, and we really never step back and think about them. So we never step back and think about, for example, in the broader discourse of psychotherapy, about concepts such as boundary or self-disclosure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We just take that on generation after generation after generation as if it is the truth. And we let that begin to inform our practices. So from a postmodern perspective, or from my bias, I'm not suggesting that you throw away all of this inherited knowledge that we have stepped into, because you can't do that, that's impossible. But that you don't just walk along blindly, that you be thoughtful, that you pause, you step back, you think carefully, and you reflect about what are the body of ideas, premises, prejudices, theories, philosophies, etc., that appeal to you, and how come they appeal to you? What do they allow you to do? What do they permit you to do? And what do they not permit you to do? The second thing that I'm going to mention, it may not be, it's not exactly in this order, is that from this perspective, there's a lot of value and emphasis placed on what's referred to as local knowledge, meaning the knowledge, the expertise, the wisdom, the habits of a particular community. That community can be a family, it can be a work team, it can be a board of directors of an organization, it can be a classroom, it can be a group like us. But that each community brings their own local wisdom, their own resources, their own ideas about what might be a misery, a pain, dilemma, a challenge, a tough decision in their life that they want help with, and they have their own ideas about what that help will look like. And they have a lot of resources there. The second one up here has to do with what I call eluding generalizations. Because one of the things that happens when you work particularly from the psychological theories that we are familiar with, and I think there are probably over 400 approaches to therapy at last count, that they begin to place people in categories. They begin to place people in boxes. They begin to influence to think in terms of problems as kinds and types. And that then you apply this solution to this person, to this problem, over and over again, regardless of who's coming in the door. So it really invites us to be very careful of not generalizing in that way. Because when you generalize and you have someone sitting in front of you and you're thinking of them as a schizophrenic or an overprotective mother or an absent father, then that begins to influence how you see that person. It begins to influence the description that you have of that person. And our descriptions then begin to influence how we hear, how we respond, and what we do. Importantly, I think that when we begin to generalize, we forget that there's a person sitting in front of us, another human being. And for me, that's the most important thing, that we're two or multiple human beings in a room, in a space together, trying to do something that's helpful for one or multiple ones of them. So a primary focus in my work is to not forget that that's a person. It's not a problem. It's not a kind of problem. It's not a category or type of a person. Also, from this perspective, there's an invitation to think about knowledge and language differently. That usually we think of knowledge as something, again, that we inherit in the sense that it's static, or that you discover it and find it, much like an archaeologist goes on a dig and finds treasures, and that knowledge can be passed from one person to the next. So to use something I heard you say many years ago, that we have to be careful not to think in terms of instructive interaction. That you cannot place a piece of knowledge, a belief, a truth, a fact, etc. into another person's head. Knowledge is not transmitted. It invites us to think not of knowledge as transmitted, but that knowledge is created among and between us, that very much influenced by social destructionism. That knowledge is something that we create between us. It's a communal, it's a social activity. Again, I like to think of it as it's created in this metaphorical space. So, for example, I have lots of things that I can share with you, and that's what I think of it is. I share it with you. I offer it. And it's influenced by everything that I bring with me into this room, and it's influenced by the experiences that I've had in this room since I've been here. And so for me, that's very important in clinical practice to keep in mind that when we are talking with another person, that not only are we having our own inner conversation about what we're having, but they are likewise. And we often don't pause to find out much about that inner conversation, because we're usually in the expert seat of knowing what the outer conversation should be. But I don't think of what I'm calling a postmodern perspective as better or more useful or more correct than any other perspective, when you think in terms of psychotherapy or any work within the human service area. I certainly don't think of it as a meta perspective. I think that it's just simply one perspective among many, and that we're each drawn toward ways of thinking and ways of working which fit for us in terms of who we are in the world, our own values, our own styles, our own circumstances, our own histories. First of all, we thought, well, we don't think in terms of techniques. We don't think in terms of skills, the way they're usually thought about in the psychotherapy arena. So how do you help someone understand how you can use the word translate these ideas, make these ideas come alive, or live these ideas in your work with your clients? So I began to talk with my students and ask them, okay, so if you were to describe to someone else what you think we're doing, what you think you're doing, what would the words be that you use? And so I begin to pay attention to that and also do some other thinking. And also begin to think, well, what we're really focusing on in our work has to do with the relationship and the conversation, and what we began to call a collaborative relationship and a dialogical conversation. In other words, talking about a particular kind of relationship and a particular kind of conversation. And then I began to think that, okay, So if I think of these assumptions as more of a philosophical position, more kind of almost a philosophy of life that would not only inform your professional work, but your personal work, then maybe what we're talking about is more a philosophy of therapy than a theory of therapy. A philosophy that informs a way of being in the world. So I want to emphasize the with, but what I'm talking with is a witness kind of therapy. I'm not talking about doing to, for, or about, but how to do something with another person. So I begin to then think, okay, so influenced by a term that Rorty uses, conversational partners, that we work, the client and the therapist are conversational partners. They're in a partnership, in a conversation, doing it together. So I would talk with my learners at the Institute about being a host and a guest. And I would say that as the therapist, you are the host. The client is your guest coming into your space. And then I say, likewise, you're not only the host for your client, but you're also a guest. You are a guest in their life. And keep in mind that you're not only a guest in their life, but you're a guest for just a blip on the screen. You're not there very long. So I say, okay, think of being a host in your office, a meeting, your home, and you had guests. What were the kinds of guests that you liked? Most importantly, what were the kind of guests that you would invite back again? Oh, you wouldn't invite an intrusive guest back? One that went into your refrigerator and pulled out your favorite bottle of Chilean wine and drank it? Or went into your bedroom and started opening your closets? So I said, okay, keep in mind, you don't want to be an intrusive guest. Okay? In other words, you don't want to pry into someone else's life without being invited or without asking permission. And in being curious, I think of myself as the learner and as the client, as the teacher. They're going to teach me, they're going to tell me what it is that they think are the most important things for me to know about them at this moment, at this time. What we were trying to do is to emphasize the importance of appreciating, valuing, respecting, using, being interested in the expertise that the client brings. It was often understood as our saying that we as therapists don't have any expertise. And so I want to say now that that's not what we meant. And I would certainly never say that I don't have any kinds of expertise, because I do. But it's not in terms of how another person lives their life. My expertise is more in how to begin to try to invite, facilitate, and sustain the particular kind of space, conversations, and relationships that I'm talking about. What's your hypothesis? What's your hypothesis? We would say, we don't have a hypothesis. We would say, we're much more interested in the mother's hypothesis, or the father's hypothesis, or the daughter's hypothesis. We're much more interested in the family members or the client's idea about what is going on, what this is all about. That we don't think in terms of those kinds of preconceived ideas about a system that then begin to inform what you notice, what you hear, and how you respond to that, and how you might try, either obviously or not so obviously, to guide or direct your client in that direction. So I suggest to my learners at the Institute that they want to be careful when they're introducing their ideas, their experiences, a piece of research they read, etc. What's the intent with which they're introducing it? What do they hope to accomplish? What is the timing? Does it fit? And when I say the intent or what they hope to accomplish, I think of introducing what we bring as a way of participating in the conversation. It's food for thought and dialogue. It's offering another possible way of talking about what we have been talking about. So I might say, as I'm working with a client, you know, as I've been talking, I'm remembering a research article that I read a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about some work with families that had a daughter with a situation somewhat similar, not exactly like yours. And would you be interested in hearing some of what this article said or suggested? So this goes to the next point that I call being public. And what I began to find is two things. Is that clients are really interested in what you're thinking as you're sitting there talking about this. And when you share some of what you're thinking, and more open with that and more forthcoming, it's less likely to become sort of this fixed description that you have in your head. Why have this private conversation that inadvertently can lead you to manipulate or try, if you can at all, to try to manipulate, try to guide or direct someone in a direction that you, from your expertise, physician thinks they should go? Why not tell them what you're thinking? Why not invite them to talk with you about that? Okay, mutual transformation, or that should be IMG, mutually transforming. That when you work the way that I'm talking about, you're really walking alongside the client. In other words, you're not trying to lead or nudge them from behind. You're not guiding them. How would you do that? Guide them by pulling them along the road. But you're walking alongside them, and if you just stop and think, as I ask my learners and used to do, you're mutually influencing each other. That as a therapist, you're not unilaterally or singularly influencing your client. Also, when you work like this, there's a lot of uncertainty because you're not determining ahead of time where you're going to go. And it doesn't mean that the client may not have a goal that you'll agree upon, this is where we're trying to go. It can be very useful, of course. Have an idea about where you're going to go. Check to make sure you've got enough gas to get there. But what's surprising when you're walking beside someone, you're involved in sort of this mutual inquiry that I'm talking about, is that you may end up someplace entirely different. Then the other thing that I began to think about is that it's not very useful to think in terms of big problems and little problems. It's not very useful for me to think in terms of major mental disorders or little neuroses, or that these kinds of people have these kinds of problems and these kinds of people have these kinds of problems. I thought, these are just challenges in situations of everyday life that any of us could face no matter where we live in the world or what our context or circumstances are. So I begin to think that what people come to consult me about, they're just simply everyday life situations. It's not a hot potato, it's not a big problem that we're going to have to solve. This is just simply something happening in their life, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to do what we can. However, there are many ways that you can do that. So what we tell our students is talk to your client about it, explain it to them that this is the procedure, this is what you have to do, and give them some examples of ways that it can be done. Talk about what the consequences, the risks are in each of these ways. And there are many ways it can be done. And it's a two-way street. And first of all, I would never enter a therapy session thinking that I had 90% of the power and the client had the other 10%. I just don't think that way. I'm much more thinking in terms of we're going to try to make this as equal a relationship as possible. And I don't think of myself, and I hope that I don't do things that guide or push the client or take over the therapy, that it's their therapy. It's a very different way of thinking about therapy, yourself as a therapist and your clients. It's a very different way of doing therapy, and I think what it takes is some experience trying to work this way to be able to have that own personal experience yourself of how a conversation can be more equal and First of all, what I mentioned a few moments ago, you have to be interested in what your other colleagues are saying. You have to be interested in their strong positions, their strong opinions, their diagnoses. You have to be interested in that. You have to ask questions. You have to be curious about it. You have to learn about that so that you can understand it from their understanding and sense-making that, not from yours. When you as I said a moment ago, when you begin to be interested in another person, it begins to shift the relationship. You're not challenging them. You're not trying to force or press something on them. And you have to be genuinely interested. I'm not talking about like a technique pretending that you're interested. The other thing that I find in agencies where people have really difficult time talking with each other and they really only address these things in a real challenging way, is they don't take time to get to know each other and they don't protect time to talk about these important kinds of things. It's really important that if you have a colleague you want to talk about something, make an appointment with them. Invite them to go to coffee. A third point is think about who should you be having this conversation with. Okay? Maybe the first person to have this conversation with is not the director of the clinic. Maybe the first person to have this conversation with is one of your colleagues who's somewhat like-minded. Where is the most likely place to get the conversation started and to begin to develop something? We were talking about the questions this morning regarding training, and also at the break we were talking about even this whole word training. It's like, can we get rid of it? Because you really can't train another person if you go back to the whole idea of instructive interaction. So what I think happens often in our graduate programs is that we try to get students to unlearn that part of being a person because they're taking on, they're assuming, and they're performing the role of the therapist. So they're performing a role rather than being a person with another person. So when you're performing the role of the therapist that many people imagine that they should be, particularly beginning therapists, it's not natural, it's not spontaneous, it's usually very scripted, they're usually very nervous, they trip over themselves trying to do it correctly, and there's no way to do it correctly. And I say to them, there's not anything that you're going to do that's going to be wrong. Most of us
do. We've learned, we've been trained, we've been taught, certainly in the probably North and South American or Western cultures. But techniques are important. You have to have a technique. You have to know how to do it. And I just simply say to the students that here, it may sound surprising, but you will not learn techniques. You're going to learn a way of being with people. You're going to learn how to talk with people, how to be in a relationship with them that is generative and in which possibilities will emerge. So going back to the idea of the apprenticeship model is that we invite our students to work along with us. They come into the therapy room with us, with our clients. They can talk, they can ask questions, they can make comments. If I'm going to visit a community agency to meet with a team or meet with a supervisor, I invite students to come with me so that they can be there and participate in the doing of it rather than just hearing or reading about it. They can experience it and do with or from that experience what works for them. People who come to therapists, we have trained them as to what therapists do and don't do. We have influenced the media. People watch movies, they read books, they watch television shows, like Dr. Phil and all of those kinds of things here that we do. So they see these things and they come and they expect that. Not only that, we each have our own reputation that sometimes we don't know about. They don't come necessarily to see me as Harlene, they come to see me as a member of this thing called the Houston Galveston Institute. What is that? What am I going to? So we have these reputations that people come to. And what I want to do is have the person begin to meet me as a person, not as a role. I find in my experience and in that of my students, and that's really all that I can speak from, is that people really like being welcomed warmly. They like being respected. They like someone being interested in what they have to say. They like to be able to tell their story the way in which they want to tell it. So I don't find, and my students don't report that the clients seem disappointed. That I always keep in mind is that we're interpretive beings. We're always in the process of interpreting and translating the other person. And we're doing that based on the pre-understandings, whether we want to call them biases, prejudices, experiences that we bring to that occasion. They cannot not be there. However, what's important is to be in the process of continually what I call sort of checking out with your client to see if you have heard, have understood what it is that they're hoping you would hear or would understand as best you can. You can never come to a complete, full understanding of another person. It's impossible. That understanding it is a dialogical process. It's something that happens between people. It's a process. It's not a thing. Okay, by being natural, I'm referring to being spontaneous, being more of a human being, not acting from a script. I do think that conversations or dialogue in therapy can be very much like everyday conversations. I don't think that there needs to be any dramatic differences. If you think in terms of your own lives, and when you have conversations with colleagues, and you begin to develop new ideas in those conversations, or you talk to a friend about a tough decision you're going to make, and you leave that conversation perhaps feeling some sense of freedom from your problem or some sense of hope that you can go on from here, not necessarily that you have the answer. So I think that the therapy conversations are and can be the kind I'm talking about, very much like everyday conversations. The difference is that people come with a particular intent, a particular agenda, a particular thing that they want help with, and of course I am there to try to be of help to them, so I would not deny that. Again, the word power is another word that's used a lot in psychotherapy, power and authority, and the therapist in a power position. We have put therapists in power positions. We have entered that into the broader cultural discourse that therapists are in a position of power and authority. You cannot not be because it's out there. However, I feel I have a lot of choice in terms of how I use that culturally granted power and authority when I'm with another person, whether it's a group of people like you in this room, or a therapy client, or with a student. I have a lot of choice. First of all, I don't like the word change. I try not to use it, although I do find myself sometimes accidentally using it. Because if you think, again, maybe exaggerating, but in the history of psychotherapy, change has often meant that the therapist is an agent of change, that you can change another person, that a person can change from this to that. It's a hierarchical, it's a dualistic concept, the way that we typically use it in psychotherapy. So that's why I use the word transforming or transformation, that I think that we're always in a process of transformation from the very first moment that we're, I guess, conceived, that we're always in the process of living and on our way to dying. And that in transformation, the differences that occur are often slight, they're not often dramatic, and I think that we're often expecting as therapists to see some kind of dramatic difference, if you want to use the word change, some kind of dramatic change. Some therapists you hear talk about change moments, or the magical moment, or the remarkable moment. That's a therapist's punctuation. Often if you ask clients, they won't even remember the moment or the question. Clients have their own perceptions of what happens, what's different in therapy. So the transformation that takes place in the conversation, through the way that in talking with another person, that what you're talking about begins to, you can think of it as transforming into something else. You can think in terms of you're beginning to develop a different idea, a different perspective. It can be in there can be so many different descriptions of what it is that occurs. But it occurs between people in the talking that they're doing. Not only the out loud talking, but also the silent talking. The other thing is that as therapists, we're often trained, or we think about quote unquote change happening in the therapy room. And I don't think it necessarily happens in the therapy room. I think most of what happens with clients that ends up being useful to them in their lives happens outside of the therapy room. I think of therapy as being like a springboard, an invitation, a platform for something that's seated or beginning in therapy to continue to have a life of its own outside of therapy, that people leave, they begin to have different kinds of conversations with themselves and with others as they move on in their life between sessions. Okay, I think that most of the advantages or disadvantages of theory or philosophy have to do with the way a person uses them. Okay? I think in my experience and other therapists that work this way and from the learners at the Institute, it really provides a lot of possibilities for working with a lot of different kinds of life situations, whether that's a family with a member who has suicide, a child who won't go to school, a couple having difficulty in their marriage, whatever it is, it allows you to adapt to that particular style, that particular way of that person, and engage in a conversation that's more unique and fitting to them in their circumstances. It also means that, and I didn't say this earlier this morning, I should have, that I did say that I'm not asking or would never think that you could give up all that you've learned. So say that you decide that you want to learn to work more collaboratively, but there's something that you really had learned before that you really, really love. Sculpting, family sculpting. I don't know if anybody in here does family sculpting. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, family sculpting. Let's say you really like that, okay? When you decide with the family, oh, I wonder if this will be useful. Again, it's something that you explore with the family. Introducing your idea, why you're thinking about this at this time, how you think it might be helpful, does it appeal to them, what do they think? You may end up doing family sculpting, you may not, you may have created with the family a different version of it. So it has to do with not only being able to let go, but being able to invite the other person into helping you let go or modify what it is that you're offering. So I think the limitations are in ourselves more so than in a theory or a philosophy. So evaluation in therapy is very, very important. From my perspective, however, what's not most useful is evaluation or assessment of the therapy at the end of the therapy, and particularly by an outsider who looks retrospectively at, creates a description of what has been done or not done and what the outcome is. And my way of working and what I encourage my learners to do is to think of themselves as researchers and research as part of everyday practice. That from the very first session, you are continually checking with your client, however you do it, at the end of the session, midway, at the beginning of the next session, how are we doing? Is this helpful? Is this useful? Were you able to talk about what you wanted to talk about? Did I not ask you about something you hoped I had asked you about? Was there something you were expecting that didn't happen? So that you continually get feedback from your client and you can fine-tune your therapy based on that feedback as you go along, rather than waiting to the end of therapy. I think maybe I mentioned this morning briefly that I think of it as not only a mandated client, but a mandated therapist. We both have to be there, and that's important for you to keep in mind. Okay? So the thing that we do is that we don't take this at face value. We don't make an appointment with that person, the mother and the family. We don't start working on the problem that they've defined. The therapist gets on the phone, calls the caseworker, the social worker, and begins to have a conversation with them. You've referred this person, thank you for the referral, and would like to know what other things about this family or this mother you would like us to know. So they begin by inviting the referring person into a conversation with them, by acknowledging the expertise that this particular agency worker has, by paying careful attention to what they say they have told the family or the mother, for example, about coming to the institute and about what they want to happen. Okay? So then the worker gets on the phone and calls up, let's say, the family. And maybe they talk to the mother. They tell the mother they've received the referral. They've talked to the social worker. These are some of the things the social worker has said. The social worker says that she wants me to make an appointment with you to talk about the situation between your husband and your daughter. But I'm wondering, do you think that that's where we should start? Or who do you think would be best to come into our first appointment? Do you think maybe you and your husband should come? Would you like us to see your daughter? So that we begin from the very beginning, inviting the client's voice into what I call the design of the therapy. I don't use hypotheses, and I don't think I have anything in my work that resembles a hypothesis. I think one of the things that happens with many innovations like hypotheses is that the concept gets lost, whereas you still have a grasp of the concept, and it becomes a technique. that's applied over and over again. And I think when you use a hypothesis in that sense, that is the therapist in a power position, with your own private explanation, idea about what's going on with the client that you really never offer to the client, and that begins to privately influence what you hear and see and how you respond.
So you have been absolutely wonderful. It's just been a pleasure being here with you. Thank you for spending your day with me, and I look forward to seeing you again somewhere sometime. So thank you.